there is a name that almost nobody knows today, not because the man who carried it was insignificant, not because what he did was minor or peripheral to the main story of the Third Reich, but because he did his work quietly, systematically, and through institutions rather than through the kind of dramatic personal actions that history tends to remember. He controlled every uniformed police officer in Nazi Germany. More than 300,000 men in green uniforms who were present at Kristallnacht, who guarded the ghettos, who participated in mass shootings across occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, who enforced every law the regime passed and carried out every order the regime gave. He built that machine. He ran that machine. And when the war ended and the reckoning came, he was taken to Prague and hanged for what that machine had done. His name was Kurt Daluege, and this is his story. Kurt Daluege was born in 1897 in Kreuzberg, a small town in Upper Silesia, the kind of borderland region that produced men with a particular sensitivity to questions of national identity. Silesia had been contested between Germany and Poland for centuries, and growing up in a place where national identity was a live political question gave men like Daluege a particular intensity about German nationalism. He served in the First World War, as virtually every man of his generation did, entering the conflict as a teenager and coming out of it in 1918 into a Germany that had been transformed beyond recognition. The empire was gone. The Kaiser had abdicated. The war had been lost in circumstances that the German right immediately began to explain through the stab-in-the-back myth. The idea that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but had been betrayed from within by Jews and communists who had undermined the war effort. This explanation was false in every meaningful historical sense, but it was psychologically compelling to men who had fought in the trenches, and Daluege was among the men it reached. He joined the Freikorps in the immediate post-war period, the irregular paramilitary units that formed from demobilized soldiers and fought against communist uprisings in Germany and against Polish forces in the contested border regions of Silesia. The Freikorps experience was formative for an entire generation of men who would later form the leadership of the Nazi movement. Men who learned in those years of street fighting and political violence that force was the primary instrument of political change, and that democratic processes were obstacles to be overcome rather than frameworks to be respected. He joined the Nazi Party in 1922, which at that point meant joining a radical fringe movement that most Germans regarded as either dangerous or ridiculous. He was an early believer, the kind of man who had found in National Socialism an explanation for everything that had gone wrong with Germany, and a program for making it right that he embraced with complete conviction. He came to Heinrich Himmler's attention in the late 1920s as the SS was beginning its transformation from a small personal bodyguard unit into the vast organizational empire that it would eventually become. Himmler recognized in Daluege the combination of ideological reliability and administrative competence that he needed as he built the SS into a parallel power structure within the Nazi movement. Daluege was given responsibility for the SS in Berlin, one of the most politically important and most contested regions in Germany, where the Nazi movement faced its most organized opposition and where the street battles between party units and their opponents were at their most intense. He performed effectively, building the SS presence in the city into a significant force and demonstrating the organizational abilities that would define his entire subsequent career. He was not a charismatic leader. He did not inspire personal devotion through force of personality or visionary rhetoric. He inspired confidence through competence, through the sense that he knew what he was doing and that the structures he built worked the way they were supposed to work. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, Daluege was positioned to take on responsibilities that went far beyond anything he had held before. Himmler was in the process of consolidating control over the German police forces, which in the Weimar Republic had been organized at the state level rather than nationally. Daluege was given responsibility for the Ordnungspolizei, the order police, the uniformed police force that was the largest single component of the German police system. More than 300,000 men in green uniforms whose presence extended into every town and city and village in Germany and eventually across occupied Europe. The Ordnungspolizei was not a glamorous command. It was the visible, uniformed, everyday police force, the men who directed traffic and investigated burglaries and responded to domestic disturbances. But Daluege understood that controlling this force meant controlling something that reached into every corner of German society in a way that even the Gestapo could not fully match. He set about transforming it from a professional police service into an instrument of the Nazi state with systematic thoroughness. Officers who were not sufficiently reliable ideologically were removed. The training curriculum was transformed to incorporate the racial ideology and political education that the SS demanded. By the mid-1930s, the Ordnungspolizei had been thoroughly transformed from the professional police service of the Weimar Republic into a uniformed force whose primary loyalty was to the regime and its ideology rather than to any legal or constitutional framework. The consequences of this transformation became visible during Kristallnacht in November 1938, the nationwide pogrom against Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes that the regime organized, while simultaneously pretending it was a spontaneous expression of popular anger. The Ordnungspolizei were present throughout Kristallnacht. Police officers who in a functioning legal state would have been obligated to protect citizens from mob violence instead stood by while synagogues burned and Jewish businesses were destroyed. In some cases, they actively participated. The professional police ethic that the force had inherited from the Weimar Republic had been so thoroughly replaced by the ideological priorities of the SS that the men in green uniforms no longer understood their function as protecting all citizens from violence, but as protecting the regime's violence from interference. When the war began in September 1939, the Ordnungspolizei expanded enormously, and its role transformed in ways that made Kristallnacht look like a preview of something far larger and far worse. Police battalions were deployed to occupied territories across Europe, and these battalions became primary instruments through which the regime carried out the mass murder of Jewish populations in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. The historian Christopher Browning studied one of these battalions in detail, and what he found was deeply disturbing, precisely because it did not fit the simple explanation that the men involved were fanatical ideological killers, specially selected for mass murder. They were ordinary middle-aged men, reserve police officers, who had been given orders to shoot Jewish civilians and who, with some exceptions, had carried out those orders. The machine that Daluege had built was capable of turning ordinary men into mass killers, not because it had found extraordinary monsters, but because it had created the conditions in which ordinary people did extraordinary evil. Daluege sat at the top of this machine throughout its most active and most murderous period. He was in Berlin, in his office, receiving reports and issuing directives, and managing the administrative apparatus of a police force that was simultaneously maintaining order in occupied Europe and participating in the murder of its civilian population. The distance between the administrator and the act is one of the central moral questions that the Holocaust raises. Daluege's post-war prosecutors in Prague did not find that question difficult to answer. They held him responsible for what his force had done, and the historical record supports that judgment. The most direct connection between Daluege and specific atrocities came in 1942, following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and one of the most powerful and most feared men in the entire Nazi hierarchy. He was assassinated in May 1942 by Czech paratroopers trained in Britain and dropped into the Protectorate in a joint special operations executive mission. He died of his wounds in early June 1942, and the regime's response was immediate and savage. Daluege was appointed acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia following Heydrich's death, placing him in direct command of the reprisals that followed. Those reprisals included the complete destruction of the village of Lidice. On June 10, 1942, SS and police units surrounded the village. Every man and boy over 15 was shot on the spot, 173 people. Every woman was deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children were taken away, most of them gassed at the Chelmno extermination camp, though a small number deemed racially suitable were sent to SS families to be raised as Germans. The village itself was burned to the ground, the ruins demolished, and the site landscaped so that no physical trace of Lidice remained. A similar fate befell the village of Ležáky shortly afterward. Daluege oversaw these operations as acting Reich protector. He did not personally pull a trigger or light a match, but he was the senior German official in the Protectorate during the reprisals, and the operations were carried out under his authority. He remained as acting Reich protector until 1943, when a serious heart attack forced him to step back from active duties. He spent the final years of the war in a reduced capacity that reflected both his physical condition and the deteriorating military situation that was consuming the regime he had served. He was captured by Allied forces after Germany's surrender in May 1945 and handed over to the Czechoslovak authorities. The Czech government had very specific reasons for wanting to try Daluege themselves. Lidice was a Czech village. The victims were Czech citizens. The destruction of Lidice had become one of the most internationally recognized symbols of Nazi brutality during the war, with towns in Britain and the United States renaming themselves Lidice in solidarity with the destroyed village, and the Czech government was determined that the man who had overseen that destruction would face Czech justice. The trial was relatively brief. The evidence was extensive, and the outcome was not seriously in doubt. He was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. On October 24, 1946, Kurt Daluege was hanged in Prague. He was 49 years old. Kurt Daluege is not a name that appears in popular histories of the Third Reich with any frequency. He does not have the demonic charisma of Heydrich or the organizational megalomania of Himmler. He was an administrator, a builder of institutions, a man who understood that power in a modern state flows through organizations and who devoted his career to building and controlling the organizations through which the Nazi state exercised its power over the people it ruled and the people it killed. The Holocaust and the broader pattern of Nazi atrocities were not carried out solely by fanatics and monsters acting on personal initiative. They were carried out by institutions, by organizations with hierarchies and budgets and training programs and reporting structures. The difference between the German state under the Nazis and a normal modern state was not that the Nazi state had found a way to mobilize monsters that other states lacked. The difference was in what the machinery was pointed at and what it was ordered to do. Daluege built part of that machinery. He pointed it in the direction he was told to point it, and hundreds of thousands of people died as a result. The village of Lidice was rebuilt after the war. A memorial stands there today. The names of the men who were shot, and the women who were deported, and the children who were taken away and killed are recorded and remembered. Kurt Daluege's name is recorded too in the verdict of a Czech court that held him responsible for what happened there and hanged him for it. History remembered Lidice, and history remembered the man who destroyed it.